Say hello to Angela.
Hi, Ange.
Okay, Angela didn't get much of an enthusiasm. Let's try that again. Say hello to Angela.
How's it going, Angela?
Hi, Angela.
Hi.
I must be really loud. I'm right next to the camera.
So, just to kind of, again, before our second vacation, or before our second December vacation, we were looking at the presidential establishment, because that's one way that bureaucratic establishment that surrounds the president is one way that presidential power expanded. Again, there's about 3 million, it's actually closer to 4 million, which is helpful because the budget is 4 trillion. So there's between 3 and 4 million governmental workers in the executive branch. There's like 3,000 to 4,000 that are appointed, and again, it's about a $4 trillion budget. That's a significant bureaucracy to wield, right? But because it is a bureaucracy, what is the EOP? Can you remember what the acronym stands for? Go ahead, Colin.
The Executive Office of the President.
The Executive Office of the President. What's the simple way to define it? It's got this kind of complex definition, but the simple way to define it is what,
It's
Colby?
a mini bureaucracy that helps the president deal with the bigger, more complex
That says something about bureaucracies, right? That I need a mini bureaucracy to manage the larger bureaucracy, right? So again, when the president first came in, they almost were like unstaffed. There's a lot of things the framers didn't anticipate. And over time, they realized you need a presidential establishment. You need, staffers that help the president carry out the role of the executive. And so we developed the EOP over time. Again, what I tried to show you is, its physical kind of location, that it's in the old executive office building where Treasury and War and State were once located. And I don't know, they have a web page that basically kind of defines up what I just said, that they're there to support the president and help them govern effectively. What it draws out is some of the subunits, because if it's a bureaucracy, it's got to have subunits, there's structures within the structure. And you don't have to be familiar with all of them, but there are some critical ones you should know. So again, tomorrow when you come in, you're going to try to put it in its place. So we're going to talk today about the EOP. You've got the kind of the surrounding policy units that I just talked about, some of them here. We talked about the cabinet. We've talked about the vice president, who doesn't seem to have their own box in here. That ought to say something, right? But you're going to try to kind of create your own version that explains where's the vice president, where's the cabinet, where's the EOP, what's within the EOP. Notice we'll also talk about some policy units today that are down here that are, in many ways separate from the EOP, okay? So what's in the EOP? Well, the NSC, keeping with the acronyms to keep things confusing, National Security Council. One of the things I mentioned earlier is, remember, every branch of the military has its own intelligence agency. Then you have the CIA and the FBI. You have all kinds of intelligence agencies and departments out there, sometimes working at common kind of issues, sometimes working maybe at cross purposes. When 9/11 happened, what we found out is a lot of the different intelligence agencies had pieces of the puzzle that might have helped us anticipate and maybe have been a little more proactive with regards to threats by terrorism. But they weren't necessarily communicating as effectively as we want. So sometimes what you need is something like the NSC to kind of coordinate all the different intelligence groups out there. So that's their job, right? It says so there. And it's kind of interesting to think about a National Security Council having a webpage and trying to make themselves somewhat transparent. But that is democracy, isn't it? That we have a right to kind of know what they're up to. And it helps you figure out what some of the things that they're targeting, like cybersecurity and transnational organized crime were two priorities that they put up on their webpage, right? So it's a kind of way to figure out what they're up to. I mentioned briefly within the EOP is this Council of Economic Advisors. Get 10 different economists in the room, you get 10 different kind of opinions. So I'm only going to have 3. It's pretty wild to think about who the 3 are. They are considered 3 of the greatest kind of like economic minds out there, I suppose, with prestigious kind of pedigrees. And they're there to kind of, again, Maybe cut down on all the different economic data and news that the president is getting. They're gonna try to give him a little more uniform economic advice, but notice again, objective is the idea. That when it comes to economics, when it comes to numbers, when it comes to kind of advice on the impact of policy on finances, we want nonpartisan, we want objective, we want professionalized. And that's their kind of goal. These are 3 members that they are subject to Senate confirmation. And again, I give you the kind of the webpage to see, you know, they busy themselves with kind of, you know, studying things and writing reports. So there's a report here that they wrote on the disconnect between resources and needs when investing in children. Like, you know, is more money for schools equal more effective education? And there's this point where maybe you hit diminishing marginal utility. That's an economic term that means you max out. Like, I could get a bigger TV, right? I could, you know, hire an intern. That actually would be pretty effective. There's things that I could do with more money, but there's a point where maybe I max out in terms of what I'm able to do. And they kind of look at that. Active labor market policies, looking at what works in terms of trying to grow jobs and expand our kind of labor pool. Looking at artificial intelligence, whether you should be wary of the robots coming and taking your jobs. On and on it goes. So these are kind of the things that they're looking at reforming the healthcare system. They're going to give you policy kind of advice on these things based on their expertise, right? So again, what do people forget sometimes when they're talking about the cabinet, the NSC, the Council of Economic Advisors? They all are giving advice. We forget that sometimes in defining what their role is. What we struggle with is what are they giving advice on that makes it distinct from economics. Council of Economic Advisors gives advice on economics. You're not going to get your 5 that way, right? That's why some of these things to illustrate are important. All right, OMB, hugely important. Office of Management and Budget. So what they're going to do is, again, notice the words that are in bold there and underlined. Professional, institutional, economic kind of advice, or in this case, we're framing it up as information. You don't want partisan kind of ideas to dictate your financial kind of analysis, because that skews it. The numbers are the numbers. The economic impact is the economic impact. If growing the deficit is going to lead to economic catastrophe, we shouldn't just be voting the party line and riding the bomb down through the anybody know Dr. Strange reference, right? You know, there's a point where we've got to look at things more objectively, and that's the job of the OMB. The other thing that they do is they have an oversight role. They'll make sure that the executive agencies and departments are also, you know, making sure that their handling of kind of their roles is also economically kind of sound and feasible and to the law, right? So when we were looking at undoing, repealing Obamacare, one of the things that the OMB is supposed to do is say, hey, what's the economic impact of that? How many would be uninsured if this happened? When they looked at their tax break that they were looking at, what would the economic impact of this be? Who would it benefit? What's the impact of growing the deficit? Who on the congressional side would give a similar, hopefully, professional, institutionalized opinion, but one that might, you know, this is for the executive branch, and it's their agency that's giving them economic advice. Who gives Congress similar kind of advice?
The party leaders?
Yeah, but there's also, again, a, you know, we've got a special institution that gives them economic kind of forecasts.
Yeah. The Committee of House and Means? Oh, wait.
So Ways and Means will kind of, from the committee standpoint, look at how we're, you know, if we're gonna raise revenue, this is how we do it. But they may not look at the trends as much. They should, but they're gonna consult this
They
group.
have one, it's shared with the Senate too, isn't it?
CBO. And it's shared. It's what gives the Ways and Means and Appropriations probably their institutionalized advice. Congressional Budget Office. So there's a CBO and an OMB, right? Remember those acronyms. Isn't the world of bureaucracy fascinating?
More like
The USTR United States Trade Representative, oh boy. What do? Well, they give advice
On trade.
on trade, and they represent people, right? What they're looking at is, yes, they are looking at trade. So what are the factors that we're worried about with trade? We're looking at opening new markets, negotiating new agreements. I can change trade to, treaties and agreements, right? And what we're looking at is a way to kind of, foster, to use relations with foreign nations, economic relations with foreign nations to kind of better our economic standing. There's lots of ways you can spin it and kind of talk about what they do. If you draw a blank, go right to the webpage, it'll tell you what they do. Okay, so do you think, again, you don't need to know the entirety of the executive office of the president, but you have some key examples of little bureaucracies that help manage all those other bureaucracies out there. There's a lot of kind of, there's the Department of Agriculture, they certainly deal with trade. Department of Interior probably has some overlap on that. Do you think the Department of State is gonna look at fostering economic development through treaties and things like that? So who coordinates all those different groups and kind of like, boils it down for the president? USTR. All right.
I'd like to see what happens to all those trees that just get thrown away, like the ones that they don't even think deserve to get up to the president.
So again, you really do have to think about the myriad of issues that are out there. And how many issues does anybody have you can't advance all 1,000 of them, right? So we've got to prioritize, and that's both from a strategic standpoint, but you also got to consider, what president am I dealing with? What is their, we'll talk about it as we get to the end. The psychology of the president really matters. So there were some presidents that might, Carter is a great example of a micromanager almost. He had this, he read everything, he had almost like a photographic memory, and he wanted to dive down in the policy. Reagan was a person that delegated quite a bit. And so, he kind of approached tackling issues a different way. He was, very adept at picking the right people and putting them in charge. Where's Trump in that? It depends if you read the explosive expose that came out that may have some legitimacy, may not. It depends on what you look at. Wolf, Fire and Fury is interesting to look at, which says that Trump doesn't like to read necessarily, and he's more instinctual. So regardless of whether you believe in the credibility of that book, what do you do if you have a president that's more instinctual, right? And wants to simplify. So that's a whole other level and lens that you have to consider. That there's all this need and demand on the president for their attention, and you got to filter it. So partly BOP filters it. Really, who filters it is the White House staff. Okay, so again, I want you to think about concentric circles. Why do I have the cabinet way out? I don't, they do. Why is the cabinet way out here? Why aren't they the inner circle?
Because usually presidents have like another staff that they go to before the cabinet.
Why not them? This is the person heading agriculture or trade or, education or.
They'll have like their own agendas. They don't always align with presidents.
So why wouldn't their agendas align? How did they get here? You're absolutely right. How did they get here?
You need to like.
Senate approval.
They had to be appointed, and then there had to be a Senate confirmation. Does that water down who the president wants, right? Puts them out here. They have their own agendas sometimes, as you pointed out. I picked them because I owed a political favor. I picked them because it helped satisfy a particular constituency. It looked good when I appointed this person who had this background. The staff, the president picks. Again, in the EOP, those positions are a result of federal statute or executive order. With the staff, it's, you don't even necessarily need, like, president can just pick. I've got an advisor, his name is Steve Bannon, he's a chief strategist. There wasn't like it's like, this is who I want, the structure is what I want, the person is who I want, and I'm gonna rely on them as much or as little as I want, okay? So this is much more fluid in terms of the ability to structure, and therefore they're much closer to the president. The only drawback is, if they're not in the Constitution, then they don't have constitutional powers. And their powers therefore are really dependent on, well, we're gonna see in a second a couple of indicators. What's their salary? That's one thing that will tell you where they are in the hierarchy. What's their proximity to the president? Are they in a broom closet next to the Oval Office, or are they got a big suite but they're in a basement somewhere? So physical location tells you something about it. Are they the last ones in the room? That ought to tell you something about them, right? So again, presidents can decide what positions to include, what the function is, what the title is, and how closely to rely on them. Certain groups became famous. So, you know, Jackson's Kitchen Cabinet, FDR's Brain Trust. And that had more to do with, they got infamy because of how the president kind of met and relied with them. Traditional positions. Again, you wouldn't have to know all, but I could see, like, again, if you want to talk about expansion of presidential power through the establishment and key players that kind of help enhance presidential power, you're going to be able to illustrate a couple of positions, right? And probably chief among them, pun intended, but not, chief of staff. Who's the current chief of staff?
Wait. John Kelly.
John Kelly. A really significant figure in a lot of ways, right? Does anybody know who was before? He was the former head of the RNC. He was considered kind of an establishment figure that was trying to help Trump do his pivot to Republican establishment.
I have a name floating around. Paul Manafort?
No, that was one of the campaign advisors.
Okay.
He's under indictment right now.
It's a guy, is it a guy?
It's a guy.
Okay, so it's not Kelly.
Because the head of the RNC right now is Romney, what's her, daughter of Mitt. Her name will come to me in a second. So he left the RNC and he's Reince Priebus.
Oh, that's
Right?
Prince Rebus.
Prince Rebus, I just did his name backwards. So he was considered that kind of that insider that was going to help Trump deal with the Washington establishment. In comes John Kelly, though, because of, again, the improvisational nature of the Trump administration, that kind of, you don't necessarily control Trump, you let Trump be Trump. But sometimes that resulted in kind of early morning or late night tweets that were, you know, kind of, oh boy, we got a lot of damage control to do. And then sometimes, you know, people would be sent out to kind of have a talking point, and then Trump would change the talking point. So Kelly was brought in to try to bring some, he's like a former Marine officer, and he was brought in to bring a little discipline. What you really want to see him as is that filter. Nothing technically should reach, people were wandering in and out of the Oval Office, apparently, because there wasn't a chain of command. In other words, is it Priebus? Is it Bannon? Is it Ivanka? Is it Jared? Who really is kind of calling the shots? Where are they in the hierarchy? It wasn't a clear kind of hierarchy, supposedly, and you know, you did see kind of a change in the administration in terms of maybe doing less damage. That news cycle got a little more stable. There wasn't like breaking news every day based on some sort of you know, bombshell revelation. So he's brought in as a filter. That's really what you want to think about. Who gets access to the president, what issues get access to the president, but they also try to control the message going out. So hugely important, although you look at like Kennedy and LBJ, they didn't really need, nor did they rely on chief of staff. So even that's not a given, right? Kennedy was more improvisational. LBJ is, you don't tell LBJ what to do. He's LBJ, he's gonna look at my scar. You're gonna see images of that in a while. You need a legal counsel. You need, because everything that the president does, you know, is of great import and weight and might have legal implications. So you want, you can't go to the, you know, Washington soon discovered that you can't go to the Supreme Court, ask them to act as your personal counsel. Should I do this? Is it legal or not? You need your own legal counsel. You need someone that basically helps with the administrative stuff. So you need a secretarial positions that help with the flow of information and communication. You need policy units, okay? El Salvador is a country that suffered 2 earthquakes, and we had supported a revolution in that country. They were, we framed them as freedom fighters that were trying to overthrow a communist government. And as a result, there was this wave of instability. It's like still one of the most poor and there's a lot of crime in there. And as a result, we had a lot of refugees, and we gave them an amnesty kind of program, that you could be here. It was temporary immunity or something like that, we phrased it as. Well, they're looking at basically saying, at what point does temporary cease to be temporary? Do we need to kind of revoke their amnesty? Do people that have been here for quite some time, there's like 200,000 of them, need to be sent back? Lots of economic implications too, by the way. It's one of the poorest countries, and you can imagine 200,000 flooding back into that country. They tend to send money to people that need money in that country. So they go from being a source of economic revenue to all of a sudden a source of liability, where they have their own struggles over, you're from our country, but you're taking our jobs maybe. At any rate, there's a policy unit that would look at immigration. Does that make sense? There's a long setup, but there's a complex issue, and you want a policy unit to look at that. So, down here, you tend to see, you see the policy development offices, where I've mentioned the NSC and the National Economic Council. We've got domestic, we've got science, environmental, drug policy. They're all part of that, those policy units within the EOP.
Now, is science, technology, and space, is that NASA, or is NASA part of that?
That's a good question. NASA is its own independent group. This is more on policy. There may be some oversight.
Okay.
But I don't know if I can answer that in an informed way as I should. So we got to kind of look that up as to who ultimately has oversight over it. I think there's overlap but not oversight. Okay. One of the things I want to point out too is the Office of the First Lady is a pretty powerful. Did we find our answer already, or a question?
I was asking to go to the bathroom, but I'll wait
Yes.
to hear the
I
answers.
get the answer. So the National Aeronautics and Space Administration is an independent
Yeah.
agency of the executive branch of the federal government. So they run the civilian space program as well as aeronautics and aerospace research.
You're going to see kind of some interesting things, like what is the post office? What is the
Bureaucracy.
Well, it's a bureaucry, but
So
what it
does
is
that
it's
mean
a
that
it's a
NASA?
public corporation. What is public television? So they run like corporate, they run like corporate entities, but they're public.
So NASA's a bureaucracy as well.
It's an independent agency, but it is a bureaucracy.
It's a
Yeah.
bureaucracy.
So they're kind of like
Everything's a bureaucracy.
special titles depending on where they are in the hierarchy. Now, what I want to point out here quickly about the Office of the First Lady is it's a pretty, it's a pretty unique position where there's this opportunity again to kind of spotlight an issue and maybe bring some of the goodwill that we typically have to the First Lady to that issue. So what I'm saying is, like, the president might get a lot of hyper-partisan criticism, but typically what we do with the Office of the First Lady is we pick a non-partisan issue that everyone can kind of agree on, and you bring, like I said, some of the goodwill typically surrounding the First Lady and the office itself to bear on that. So with Michelle Obama, it was the idea of obesity and jump up and go and healthy eating. And Veterans Affairs was another big issue, helping out returning veterans. And Melania Trump has some of that same work with veterans and is also
Bullying.
championing, who said it?
Bullying.
Bullying, right?
Cyberbullying more specifically.
And cyberbullying in particular. Really, the camera's on, so I'm really trying not to editorialize. But given the president's penchant for dropping names, like Sloppy Steve, everybody loves Sloppy Steve. It was a great new nickname, but he, Little Marco and, or actually it was Little Marco and Little Bob Corker. He used Little a couple of times there.
Rocket Man.
Rocket Man and Little Rock. He likes Little a lot. Now it's just occurring to me, like Little Rocket Man. What are some of the other Low Energy Jeb? He's hands out nicknames left, and they stick. Pocahontas being another kind of good example. So I do find some irony there. Okay, and it's all on camera. Go ahead. So one of the things I want to point out is that, again, because they're not part of the confirmation process, they're part of the inner circle. You don't have to water down your appointments. They are free from divided loyalties. But again, the lack of constitutional language, a lack of a confirmation process also is a double-edged sword. It means no real constitutional or statutory powers, okay? So what you look to kind of divine who they are and where their power comes from is, like I said, the money. This is outdated, but an article from 2014, but it gives you a rough estimate of close to 500 staffers. They collectively draw a salary of around, it's just under 40 million. And again, it's all public, so you can kind of see who they are. And you can actually look at their salary as part of a public record. So it kind of lets you know who surrounds the president, okay?
The first lady gets paid.
What's that?
The first lady gets paid as well, looks like. This is off to the first lady up there.
I'm feeling like there's an office and there's staffers that get paid, but the first lady doesn't draw a separate salary.
That would make sense because she's
so-
not
Not an elected official, and not an appointed official either. It's just
She's
she's
just
using
there.
that official role to kind of do service.
Right.
So she definitely has a staff that is paid. And I don't know, that the first lady went on a speaking tour and like it was charging for those speeches. First ladies sometimes write books. A lot of times what they do with the books though is like they donate the proceeds to charity and things like
Right.
that. So we haven't had anybody use the office of the first lady to try to like purely drive profit and put money in their pocket using the position.
Right.
Really good piece I heard. It was one of the most effective ways of saying what is always in the back of my mind. Our system is really predicated on norms, not written rules. When it comes to the rules of politics, they're norms. Does that make sense? We follow them because it's part of the tradition and we feel an obligation to follow them, but it's not because of a written rule.
Yeah.
So a lot of these, like what can the first lady do and get away with, is a little tricky. That takes a deeper dive in terms of research. All right, one of the other sections I want to look at is having looked at the institutional, the role that institutions play in growing presidential powers. What role do presidents play themselves? Ideally, what you're going to be able to do is to cherry pick a series of presidents and talk about here's how Washington impacted the office, or Adams or Jefferson or FDR or whoever your choice is. So I'll do kind of a snapshot, and obviously I'm going to look at the first series of presidents because being first they had more of an impact in defining the office. But we'll kind of highlight some of the more historic and the ones that sometimes are given credit for really defining the office. And we'll also look to a certain degree at some of the modern ones as well. So Washington, again, he's 80% of the test, right? Washington is amazing because he is the first and he is going to define the office. Everything he does sets a precedent. A precedent is where you do something for the first time. If it stands, it becomes the norm. Does that make sense? Like once you do something for the first time, we talked about like if you did something for the first time and you got away with it, it becomes a right, right? Well, in this case, it becomes an expectation. So what does he do? Well, it basically helps define the office, but he does with a very deliberate restraint. What I admire about Washington is he wields power, but he does not want it. He does it more out of a sense of obligation, out of duty. He talks about the day he assumed the presidency as like his darkest day ever. That's amazing. He's inheriting the most powerful position in the United States, and yet he looks at it as one of the darkest days ever. And he's willing to step away from that when we want him to be in power indefinitely. So again, that helps define him. Again, you see him, even prior to him assuming office, he definitely, he would show up in as the Continental Congress met in his uniform every day. I think he wanted military leadership, and showing up in his uniform definitely sent that signal. But even that was a heavy burden and crown on his head. And he was quick when the revolution ended to kind of lay down the sword, literally in a ceremony, to hand back power. So, but he, as much as he wanted to go retire and become that gentleman farmer, he stayed around to kind of keep the country from going from revolution while we drafted that Constitution in a period of economic uncertainty when we hadn't paid the Continental Army. Everything about him is duty, right? So what are some of the interesting things about him? Well, just even the title, Mr. President, this less formal, less, what's the word I'm looking for? There's less pretense, I guess, to that kind of title. It's more humble, the title. There were ones that were kicked around like His Highness, or His Elective Majesty, and this is Adams.
What's the crazy one?
Adams was His Highness the President of the United
Yeah.
States and protector of their liberties. And then you gotta come up for air, after kind of exhaling that. He is the one that starts that informal practice of meeting with advisors, and from there develops the tradition, that's all it really is of the cabinet. So he'll help establish the cabinet system. In the Constitution, it reads that the president will negotiate treaties with the advice and consent of the Senate. And initially, that's a little vague, so he thought he had to kind of like check in with the Senate as he dealt with foreign powers. And eventually, this is ridiculous. It's easier to kind of ask for forgiveness than permission. Some of you operate your lives on that philosophy, right? It's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. He just basically said, I'm gonna negotiate first and ask for permission second. And that became the trend, okay? He delegates almost no power to Adams, hence his quote about the most insignificant office ever there was or ever that we have imagined and conceived. It's not only the worst office around, but it's also the worst one we can imagine. He's willing to use federal troops in the Whiskey Rebellion to uphold federal law. So again, there is this restraint, but there is also this idea of, he executed people when they rebelled and were treasonous. There's instances where he was forgiving and issued a pardon, but he can toe the line when he has to. Establishes the two-term trend, and that one might be one of the more significant ones. Again, what I think is amazing is this idea of he never felt like he was greater than the office. The office is what, a lot of people talk about don't disrespect the president. And I don't think that means you can't criticize the person holding the office. I think if you do it in a rational and informed way, the person holding the office isn't sacrosanct. The office itself, we ought to have some reverence for. Provided it's it's consistent with our norms and our traditions.
Like, we hate Congress, but we don't always hate the president.
Right. We kind of are able to kind of like critically look at them as an institution, as a body.
Right.
Right? But we love our congressmen, because they're
Right.
bringing home the pork. We tend to kind of, I think, more conflate the singular nature of the president with patriotism and loyalty.
Right.
And that's dangerous. You always ought to speak truth to power, no matter where it resides. And there ought not to be a fear with that. The question is, do we become hypercritical just because of partisanship? That I think is misguided too. Truth to power means literally truth, not just partisanship. So, okay to look at the president kind of critically, but don't lose the norms and what the office represents in the process, right? So there he is, handing power back. I don't know why they always draw young people as like, adult heads on little bodies. Always a weird trend. All right, Adams, what am I gonna say about Adams? What am I gonna say?
He's not a good president.
He's not a good president, he's just sour, grumpy, right? And he is, I would say, there's two halves to Adams. There's that remarkable figure during the Revolutionary period. You watch him fight for ideals and principles. He's
My research paper on it.
all right. Defends the soldiers during the Boston Massacre because truth is truth, and the law is blind to kind of partisan ideas. And he's this remarkable figure that has authenticity when he tracks to supporting the revolution. When he's president, though, he does more to bring about partisanship than, and Jefferson is his co-equal in this. As much as Washington warned us about partisan politics and getting intertwined with foreign affairs, which hard not to, Jefferson, squarely kind of makes us a little more partisan. A lot of it, the backdrop is the elections of 1796 and 1800, right? 1796, again, is a confusing one because people, again, there weren't political parties during Washington's day, and he warns us against them, and yet in the election of 1796, we're running as parties, right? You've got the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists are about more power to the national government. Adams would often say democracy is for election day, and then the mob needs to go away, and let more rational people run the country. In order to have as much power as they wanted for the national government, they believed in loose interpretation. They were more from the Northeast kind of manufacturing corridor, therefore they favored a powerful government that could encourage trade and manufacturing, whether it's in the form of tariffs or other economic policies that encourage that. And our biggest trading partner was England. Again, they're a manufacturing power in of themselves, but we often needed the machinery from them. And they often were a marketplace for a lot of our raw materials. So this is how they align, and just flip it for the Democratic Republicans. Jefferson wanted everybody to be a farmer because you would own land, and if you own land, you'd be vested in this country, you'd be willing to defend it. He feared a concentration of powers. So not only did he want, power in the hands of the people, but he saw the states as their agents. So get everybody to be a farmer and give states a lot of power, and you're gonna have a stable, people that are willing to defend the country and check the power of the federal government. That requires a strict interpretation of the Constitution. Given that he favors agricultural interests, it puts him at odds with the Federalists, and they're pro-French, okay? Because that's the opposite of English at this point. All right, so these are two, and again, picture how the French Revolution really becomes a difficult issue here. French Revolution is about liberty, equality, and fraternity, right? Are we pro that? Do we have our own revolution?
Yeah.
Did they help us in our revolution?
Oh, yeah.
They were instrumental. Do we support theirs?
No.
Right up to like Robespierre, Reign of Terror, lots of blood. This becomes, that French-English identification does become a little bit of a wedge as the French Revolution goes wild.
The French Revolution is more of an actual revolution than the American Revolution was.
If you're talking about trying to redefine political norms, change the social hierarchy, like ours was more about maintaining status quo and like the powers of certain like economic interests, maybe.
Right. Like the French, it was an actual revolution because the bottom became the top and
Yes.
the top became the bottom.
And what the hell, they
top
wanted to redo the calendar, they wanted to get rid of the church. You look at how transformational theirs
Okay,
is.
they're definitely on the bottom.
It's much more radical. Now,
They're
really
so
quickly,
far
guys,
down the ground.
before we lose time, because of that hyper-partisanship and that bitter, again, in that election, there are definite political opposites, but we don't vote in the Electoral College according to party. It's just the top vote getter gets to be president, the second top vote getter gets to be vice president, hence Adams, top vote getter, Jefferson, second top vote getter. Guess what? You're husband and wife now. The line is, what's that?
If you had, like, people said, like, this was my vice president, and now my vice president, but people had to vote twice, and then the top.
They didn't run with running mates. They didn't run as a ticket. They ran as a person, representing a party. And so, again, they just hadn't anticipated, they get put together as these odd political kind of bedmates. This is what will follow, okay? So
Chaos.
we'll have to pick
Chaos
up with that
follows.
tomorrow. And again, your job tonight is just to catch up in the study guide as to where I'm at.
I don't know if Mr. Franco told you so. Like at the end of every year, we take our presidents and line them up in order of best to worst.
Yeah.
That was the cross we nailed Adams to, and collectively put Adams in the back.
Adams got far.
When you look at it in its substance, the fact that it expires when Adams is set to leave office
Right.
lets you know it's partisan.
Yeah.
So this is the way I go after my political enemies, but you can't use it to go after me if I lose the election.
How did that,